Welcome, everyone, to this Good Leadership Podcast. My name is Charles Good, your host and the president of the Institute for Management Studies. This podcast is designed to provide you with actionable insights and tools that you can use from discussing the research, stories, and background from recognized experts and practitioners to accelerate your impact in your current role. Welcome, everyone, to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. Today's episode is going to be with a very special guest talking about a self-help guide to get you to where you can thrive in the midst of adversity. My guest is Brent Gleeson, a Navy SEAL combat veteran and award-winning entrepreneur, a best-selling author, and the acclaimed speaker on topics ranging from leadership and building high-performance teams to culture, resilience, and organizational transformation. Welcome to the program, Brent.
Thanks so much. It's an honor to be here.
Great. So before we get started in unpacking some of this great model and your philosophy around your book, love to just get more of a background from you to give our listeners about your military experience and then kind of that transition into becoming a business entrepreneur.
Yeah, sure. I'll just give you a high-level backstory real quick. Grew up in Dallas, Texas. Did my undergraduate education at Southern Methodist University. Got degrees in finance and economics. So naturally, upon graduation, I took a job as a financial analyst with a big firm. I was officing there in downtown Dallas. During that time, I had a close friend of mine from college who was a year behind me in school. And he was one of these young men that more or less had a lifelong dream and a vision to graduate, join the Navy, and at least attempt to be accepted into the notorious Navy SEAL training program. Well, at the time, of course, I thought that was highly admirable and a call to serve. I also thought that was probably one of the most unrealistic career paths a young person could pursue. I had not had any lifelong aspirations of joining the military, but he and I started training together. So when I was a senior, he was a junior. Then when I was out working, my first job out of college, he was a senior. We started training every single night during the week, on weekends, distance running marathons, swimming, calisthenics, everything we needed to do to prepare him for just the entry level physical test to get into the program, which really is the easy part, but a lot of people fail it. So it's kind of controlling your controllables. And for me, it was just a way to stay fit, have an accountability partner, and spend time with a good friend. But by nature of that training regimen, we started spending a lot of time together and having a lot of dialogue about the implications of this journey that laid before him. And it piqued my interest, of course. So I started reading books about the history of naval special warfare from our forefathers in the underwater demolition teams in World War II through Korea to where we really cut our teeth as an elite assault force in Vietnam and then beyond. And I really found a fascination with the organization itself, the culture that has been designed over the years, and it continues to evolve, but also how we build teams, how we build leaders at every level in the organization, and mixed with somewhat of a little bit of a selfish personal challenge, the growing fascination coupled with the somewhat tedious and boring nature of my 90 hours a week in financial analysis bloomed into the obvious choice to leave that job behind and go do something easier, which was naval special warfare. And so I literally wrote my parents a letter. I remember I was sitting on the 42nd floor of a building in downtown Dallas, wrote my parents a handwritten letter telling them that I was quitting my job, that they were just thrilled that I had in the first place, and teaming up with my buddy Matt. And we packed up. We moved to Colorado to a town called Crested Butte, where we trained at high altitude for another 6 months. And then early 2000, less than a year before 9/11, we joined the Navy. And soon after that, we were at the first portion of SEAL training. We might get into that later. The first 6 months of it is called BUDS, or Basic Underwater Demolition SEAL. Typically what you're going to see on TV, documentaries, things like that. And was, by the grace of God, successful in that endeavor and was assigned to SEAL Team 5 and did several combat deployments in the teams, a couple to Iraq, Africa, some other places. Had not planned at the time of doing that as a career. I ended up sticking to that plan, transitioning out. I immediately jumped into an MBA program where I met my first business partner. I then dove headfirst into the world of entrepreneurship and business, which arguably has about the same failure rate as SEAL training. So somewhere along the lines, I found a taste for calculated risk, or maybe blind dumb risk, or somewhere in between. So that kind of takes us up to where we are now. I've built a couple companies, exited 2 previous ones, and currently running TakingPoint Leadership. We're a management consulting firm, work with leadership development with organizations all over the world.
That's a great backstory. Fascinating. We're going to dive into some of that throughout our time together today. But you'll love to talk a little bit about, why you think there's just all of the SEALs. I mean, there's so many famous ones now, from David Goggins, who wrote the foreword to your book, to Chris Kyle, to Marcus Luttrell. I mean, there's a lot of business books, leadership books that really are based with that mindset or philosophy. Why does that resonate so well in the business world with with leadership, with effectiveness, with execution?
Well, I think arguably Naval Special Warfare is one of the most elite, high performing organizations in the world. And it's like a large, complex corporation. So there's a lot of parallels in leadership, how you build teams, how you keep people engaged, how you combat, fatigue and disengagement and all the different elements that we have to overcome in any organization, especially as it grows or goes through significant change. I mean, look at, the military and especially the special operations communities, almost constant state of organizational change since 9/11. Been constant bringing lessons learned from the battlefield, changing the way we train, the way we fight, the way we're structured, the way we deploy, the resources we invest in, all the way down to our talent acquisition strategies, our talent retention strategies, just like any large organization would do, which obviously comes with a lot of pain, a lot of suffering, a lot of embracing of the suck, if you will. So obviously, by the unfortunate nature of being at war for 2 decades, we have droves and droves of veterans entering the workforce every single day, with a lot of them being in elite military units like special operations or fighter pilots or what have you, or intelligence. And those people are bringing somewhat of a new perspective, or at least a very honed perspective on what high performance really should look in a good business organization, and how all those leadership and behavioral aspects of building great teams and a great culture drive growth, they drive sustainability, they drive profit. A lot of the things that organizational leaders who don't necessarily have that background and have led in very, very, very complex, adverse situations look at things obviously through a different lens. So the veterans coming into the workforce now have these opportunities to tell great stories, whether you're talking about Chris Kyle or Marcus, or great stories of heroism on the battlefield. There's a lot of insights that we can learn from how decisions are made, to servant leadership, to culture, to how teams work effectively together, despite a lot of the internal and external forces pushing against their potential success. So overcoming obstacles and being really, really much more adaptive and accepting of change than a lot of our modern organizations have been in the recent past. So some of those are some of the elements that you start seeing that you can really draw some pretty specific parallels and ties into how to level up as leaders in civilian organizations today.
And I agree with you, and I'm glad you unpacked that, because they still see a certain subsection of companies and leaders thinking that military is separate, that there's no lessons to be learned, and that's completely untrue. There's a lot of, like you said, innovative solutions. I mean, they deal with highly complex situations and adversity all the time, and we have this resource, this talent resource that we're not leveraging, and that really has fueled a lot of interest and demand for especially special operations people coming into the business environment and sharing their skills and insights that have been honed through decades in the military.
Right. Yeah. I mean, everything we do, because, forcibly, like I said, being honed over decades of training, decades of war, no organization is perfect. SEAL teams, Green Berets, Bank of America, whoever you're talking about, all organizations are imperfect by nature because they're made up of humans. and therefore they're fallible by nature. But I think it's also how you look at making those parallels, how you can extract those. You'll see people like, well, we're not SEALs, or we're not getting shot at, our lives aren't on the line. Put all that stuff to the side. You're talking about the principles of high performance. You're talking about results orientation. You're talking about relationships. You're talking about the people practices. You're talking about strategic prioritization. Just like in any organization, you have to deal with every single day. Those are very clear parallels. And, in Naval Special Warfare, we've just gotten really good at doing it exceptionally well. So there's key lessons to be learned, whether you're a, 3-month-old startup to a, 50-year-old, 4th-generation family-owned construction company. there's ways you can look at how we apply that knowledge and those lessons into creating really sustainable, adaptive organizations that embrace change, that will stand the test of time beyond their competition.
Absolutely. And embracing change also involves kind of that mindset that the title of your book, Embrace the Suck, which this book is a great book, provides an actionable roadmap that empowers you to really to expand your comfort zone to living a more purpose-driven life. But if you could just unpack that philosophy a little bit more to give people a little more context on really what this means.
Sure. So my first book, Taking Point, is more of a business oriented book. There's stories in there, but it's really more focused on leading change in an organization, organizational transformation, change leadership, change management. And then we built a company around that. A lot of our curriculum was designed to that. So over the past several years, in having the opportunity to work with organizational leaders all over the world with different cohorts, different types of organizations. There's so many obviously nuances in the work-life balance these days. It's just full work-life integration. It's just how do you integrate it and how effectively you integrate it. But I was thinking, well, maybe there's a more of a personal transformation story here that could be told. Because with every leader or leadership team we've worked with, you obviously get down into the very personal elements of their levels of resilience, their levels of ability to engage others, and how that how their personal life impacts how they show up to their teams at work, whether that be in person or virtual. And so the wheel started turning, and I'd never been a guy who was into reading self-help books or listening to self-help podcasts. I was like, well, shit, maybe I should get out there and see what resonates and what doesn't. So I started reading a bunch of different self-help books. I actually started with the Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck, which I thought was masterfully written, especially for the guy's done phenomenally well, but not necessarily someone with a ton of life experience. So the way he crafted the narratives in that book obviously resonated with millions and millions of people. And then I looked at some other books, and some I thought was interesting, some I thought wasn't, some I thought was interesting reads, but just fluff that's not actionable. So I wanted to find something in between that would resonate with people, but that's highly actionable. So if you're going to talk about a story or a theory, have a model to go with it, and something that people can literally, when we write articles or I write books, I want that type of content to be something people can go back to over and over again. And if they listen to the audiobook, they go back and buy the actual book so they can take notes and highlight things and use these things as a tool. So that's where the concept of Embrace the Suck came from as a book, and then started doing a lot of research on resilience and some behavioral psychology and how that applies, not from a leadership standpoint or in the workplace, but just in general in lives. How do we become more resilient? Are you born with resilience and grit, or do some people have more resilience in their gritty bank account than others? Do you have to forcibly develop it over time intentionally? And it's kind of all of the above, what I've found. And as you see in the book, there's stories of, that's what's interesting about SEAL training. It's a fascinating social experiment, if you will. Let's say you start with a class of 200, you could never, ever successfully identify the 20 or 30 that are standing tall at graduation. You might be right a couple times, just, by accident or out of luck, but traditionally you're going to be incorrect in your assumptions about people and their levels of resilience and where that comes from, regardless of their background. You get people from different financial backgrounds, educational backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, religious backgrounds. Even though you look at a bunch of SEALs, they might look similar in nature physically, but you're talking about a very wide level of diversity of thought, diversity of experience, and even background too. So those were some of the things that came together and looking at, well, what makes a resilient person? Some person with this background that's totally different than that person, yet they can accomplish the same things and overcome the same obstacles. Why is that? So that's what initially piqued my interest in doing research on resilience and mental toughness.
Well, and you have the definition of resilience really into three categories, right? There's a challenge phase, commitment, and then control. Could you talk a little bit about each one of those?
Sure. So of those three pillars, you can break it down into many, but broke it down on the research into these three pillars of challenge. So the more resilient individual or more resilient team, if you want to look at it from a team dynamics perspective, they see challenges as opportunities. So look at it as, a lot of this really falls under the umbrella of stoicism, if you really think about it. So looking at it from a stoic standpoint, the mindset of stoicism, you're looking at challenges as opportunities for growth and development, opportunities to build resilience, to drive innovation, creativity, whether it's yourself, your others. I'm currently reading The Daily Stoic again, and it breaks down a quote from Marcus Aurelius or a couple other philosophers, and every day there's a quote and then an explanation of how to apply that, and there's a theme for the day. And yesterday's, I believe it was, wise people have no problems. And it goes into exactly what we're talking about right now. Is like, they have problems like everyone else. They just look at things through a totally different lens by seeing, kind of like, a lot of your listeners probably know who Jocko is. And, that he has that philosophy where you say like, oh, something shitty happens. Good. What are we going to do about it? What are we going to learn from it? Good. I mean, we don't all initially think that way. It would be inhuman for us to be like, oh, great, I just lost that big investor that I was hunting for 6 months, or that deal we were working on for a year just fell apart at the last minute. Nobody thinks that way initially, but if you can continue to train your mind to be like, all right, what I was talking about where wise people have no problems is looking at, kind of more of that contingency plan thinking of what's the worst that could happen, and seeing almost in a way of changing your mindset. Like, I hope that happens because I have a plan for that and we'll adapt at that time. If the other good stuff happens, great, you're winning. So you're either winning or learning. There's not that mindset of I just failed or I just lost. It's no, we didn't quite make the mark, didn't quite achieve that goal, but I had a plan for that, so we're gonna pivot to that level. So it kind of goes into people looking at challenges as opportunities for growth. Now, commitment obviously goes into resilient people are deeply, deeply committed to their goals and what they're trying to accomplish. They're also very good though at prioritization. We have that sort of all in all the time philosophy in naval special warfare. People are like, well, what does that mean? How can you be all in on everything? You're 100% not all in on everything. It's about prioritization and execution. So people who are more resilient typically are very, very good at looking at the goals they want to achieve, the prioritization of those goals, the duties for execution to achieve those goals, and everything else that doesn't associate with that, they get rid of it and they don't focus on it. Just like a company with a great mission, anything outside that mission or outside their core values or stated, behavioral standards, they don't engage in, and therefore they don't get distracted by things that are not associated with the goals they're trying to achieve. So they can be more committed and give more of their time, talent, and energy to achieve those goals because they're not distracted by shiny objects. And then finally, control is just really focusing on this is really one of the most fundamental elements of resilience and even stoicism is focus on, I don't like to say ignore things that are out of your control because you want to maintain situational awareness, but focus your time and energy on the things you have control over, or at least are within your sphere of influence. And everything else, you put it off to the side. If you're trying to, just like when I made the obvious decision to transition from finance to naval special warfare, I quickly realized that everything in my world would have to change. So looking at challenge, commitment, and control, anything outside of those three dimensions that I just described went away, including most elements of my social life, how I spent my time before work, after work, on the weekends, even going as far as removing certain people from my life that I knew would stand in the way of achieving that goal. I'm talking more about like the naysayers and people like, you're never going to do that. That's a stupid choice or what, anything like that. Or people who would try and, buddies who would be like, no, don't go train, come to the bar and drink with us. Nope, you're out of here. Anybody who's going to distract me from that goal. And I mean, meaningful things, but it was radical change to achieve a very lofty goal. Just like anytime anybody, you or anyone else has achieved a big goal in their life, it didn't come without sacrifice. It didn't come without cutting out other things and making better decisions to stay the course and not get distracted by, again, the shiny objects and competing priorities.
You're right that, and we'll be talking in a few minutes about the temptation tiger and all those temptations that's just easier to plan for and avoid than try to overcome when you're in the middle of that. I mean, someone once told me, if you're an alcoholic, you don't go to the bar to eat pretzels, right? It's just not a good environment to be in. So with that too, the control piece, so essential. And a lot of people take on stuff that they can't even control to get stressed and worried. And you have a great story that I want you to share later regarding that. But first, just looking at pain as a pathway, pain can be an incredible pathway to living an extraordinary life if it's used correctly with the right mindset. You just have to embrace it. So a lot of people, when they're going through adversity or pain, they don't want to fully experience it. They want to put it off. They want to avoid it. But what you suggest and what you recommend is people to challenge that perspective, right? And fully experience your pain and emotions, fully process them because you're going to come out stronger on the other end.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some varying nuances there to what I share in the book about suffering practices to using pain as a pathway to embracing. Obviously, you want to be sensitive to people's different situations. I mean, we're not talking about things that are just unimaginable, like the loss of a child or loved one, and other things like that. Those are, and those things are quite common, unfortunately. But so you can still apply these same philosophies just in slightly different ways. So don't want to sound insensitive to people who are going through just the most unimaginable sadness and depression for things like that. But when you look at it too, a lot of us, and this goes back to questions I get asked about, the difference between the people who are successful in the early stages of SEAL training and who are unsuccessful. And really, it's easier to talk about the people who are successful and why they are, because there's all different reasons, a different emotional and physical journey for every student, and with almost a 90% all said and done, 90% failure rate. There's all different types of reasons and how well they prepared or didn't prepare. But in those moments, people who have suffered the most, in this world have typically, and this is just my opinion, obviously people know this and there's a lot of research, that come out typically stronger, more self-aware, more empathetic to others. They engage in greater degrees of altruism and giving back. And the most resilient people will use their suffering and experiences to lift others up. You see that in SEAL training too, where sometimes the people who are suffering the most, the small guy who doesn't look like he would make it, and he's shivering his butt off so bad his teeth are chattering and cracking, and but yet somehow it's that person that gets up and stands tall once again, not for himself, but to pick up the person to his left and the person to his right, making that suffering about them, not about oneself. And so shifting that mindset, that narrative in your way of thinking to, thinking about we're all suffering together. So let's find ways to lift one another up in that regard. And when it comes to your point around some of the suffering practices that I talk about in the book, one is to really lean into it and experience those emotions in full. Analyze it, get therapy, have a trusted advisor, a coach, a mentor, a spouse, whoever that person is, a person or persons where you can be fully open, fully transparent, and feel those emotions all the way through. And we all know that bottling these things up, and men tend to be good at this, not to, put, a sexist approach to this, but men tend to be really good at putting stuff in boxes, and we stuff those boxes way down. I have a real good knack for that. But the people who heal faster and then are able to see the world through a different and better lens, usually unpack those boxes a lot faster. They analyze the content of those boxes, and they're able to come to some sort of resolution through whatever their version of a root cause analysis is, and applying those insights into the situation and what they can learn from that, or how they're going to take that and apply that to regaining their happiness, rebuilding relationships, whatever that scenario might be, but finding ways faster than others and more successfully than others in utilizing the pain and adversity to build something great and purpose driven from that.
Right. And you said something about the root cause analysis, which I think you give a great model on that in your book to kind of process through these adversities, because I think that mindset shift where you have to move past why me, why now, to finding maybe a new path to say, what have I gained from this? And how can I use this for fuel for my journey forward? Because I'm sure you have lots of experiences through your training, through SEAL training, through other people. I read David Goggins' book, Can't Hurt Me. I mean, and just the way they've reframed it and change that into something that's motivating, that gets the fire burning within to push them a little bit further.
Yeah, no, 100%. Because again, we're talking about two types of suffering. In the book, we're talking about suffering that's imparted upon you through external events and things that, whether it's cancer or the loss of a loved one, or, losing a business, or whatever those challenges we all inadvertently face multiple times throughout our lives. And then the purposeful suffering, like we'll get to here in a little bit, but purposeful suffering obviously is identifying the adversity that comes with the achievement of specific goals or the path that you're going down in life, whatever that path might be, identifying the adversity that will come with it, and then embracing and leaning into those elements as best you can as part of that, as a crucial part of that journey. But going back to what we're talking about is the suffering that, we don't typically want. Obviously, but which is inevitable, and reminding ourselves. So sometimes we have to do this on a daily basis. That's why I believe in having good daily routines and morning routines to get yourself in the mindset for the day, that you might have to put your battle gear on, and you might engage in some warfare, but you have the right mindset to do it while hoping for the best, but also planning for inevitable obstacles that you maybe don't foresee as well. So.
Well, and that brings to mind, throughout your training, I mean, it's a long, arduous training, perhaps the most difficult of any in the military, but how did you retain your resilience? How did you get up and just say, each day, say, I'm going to embrace the suck of the day. I know it's going to be bad, but what fueled you to keep you going? And what tips maybe could that impart to those listening, like leaders on the call here?
I think that the students, not singling myself out, but the students that are most successful in SEAL training do two things simultaneously very well. And we've studied these things, because to bring it back to human resources, with a 90% failure rate per class, 6 classes a year, we have what one might consider a significant talent acquisition challenge. So we're always trying to identify better talent to put in the top of that funnel. And so we've obviously done a lot of research on the mental, emotional, cognitive, and physical attributes of students more likely to successfully navigate that training pipeline, especially those early weeks and months where we're weeding students out. And one of the things that we found is students that are successful can do two things simultaneously. There's almost kind of an interesting dichotomy there. One is they have and maintain a deep emotional connection to the mission and purpose of our organization. They're not there because they want to be in the military. They're there because they want to be a naval special warfare operator, a Navy SEAL, period, full stop. That's it. Some of them have wanted that since they were in seventh or eighth grade. I've mentored some of those folks, and it's fascinating. And then some kind of made more of a decision. Like one of my mentees did exactly what I did. He was in finance for a year and then decided to join the program, trained, and was successful. And so they knew first they do that. They're able to maintain that long term because this is it's a long training pipeline, and like you said, one of the hardest in the world, and physically, emotionally, and there's the academic element too. You got to make the grade too, so you're being physically and emotionally tortured, but you also have homework and tests to study for. It's like the worst grad school program you could ever imagine in your entire life, and a long one at that. And so you have just like in any organization, you want any team member, especially a leader, to have an emotional connectivity to the mission and purpose. They believe in it wholeheartedly, authentically. They're fully engaged, and they don't just want to be a part of NSW. They need to be a part of Naval Special Warfare. Then in the moment, they also simultaneously, while maintaining that long-term emotional connectivity to the end goal, which is becoming a SEAL and being an operator, far down the line, in those early days, you cannot see light at the end of the tunnel. There's no glimmer. There's no glimmer of hope, and hope is not a strategy. But in the moment, they don't just shrug and say, well, this is probably going to suck really bad. They lean fully in to the pain and suffering, almost to the point, like I was saying before, from a stoicism standpoint, they want it to be worse than it truly is. Just like David said in the forward of the book, where he told actually one of my mentees that I just mentioned, that was a text message to Charlie, who lost his mother to a brain aneurysm a week before he checked into Butts. I was like, please send him a text. I didn't know if he would even respond. He sent this long text, basically with that philosophy in mind, is don't just accept it. Pray for it to be the worst hell week of any class ever. Pray for it to be colder. Pray for it to rain every single day, 24/7. Pray for people around you to be quitting and miserable, but you're the one standing tall. So kind of that mindset of knowing it's going to be bad, but hope for it to be even worse, then maybe you'll be pleasantly surprised, to kind of put a little twist on it. But basically, they lean into the pain and suffering, most importantly, because they know it is a critical part of their developmental journey. It is a must. It's an imperative. Every SEAL has been through that same journey. Therefore, they must go through that same journey as well. So it's not just being accepting of it or trying to do the bare minimum to get through. We have a term called the gray man in Bud's classes, where they kind of hide in the middle. They don't want to overperform and be noticed. They don't want to underperform and be noticed. That strategy never works, by the way. Instructors are looking at everybody. But those two things simultaneously, long-term emotional connectivity to the vision and goal, while in the moment, they are leaning into the pain and suffering every single second, every hour, every day as part of their journey. They're not shying away from it.
Some great insights there. Thank you for unpacking that. I think the journey is also easier. That personal transformation and the embrace the suck journey often involves a values analysis, right? Because before you can start getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, you really have to identify what your moral convictions are so that you're authentic and aligned with those. And you have a great tool for that, that personal values manifesto, maybe if you could talk about for our listeners to just help them identify those.
Absolutely. This is actually a model that we take organizational leaders through in a lot of the programs that we do, especially programs that are more geared towards values-based leadership, which is something we get requested to partner with in companies on quite a bit. And I'll briefly explain that, looking at the organization's core values and doing some different exercises to see how those different leaders have shared values or some degree of shared values and shared purpose to the organization's mission and values. But then looking at those and breaking those values down into a systematic way where you can identify very specific behavioral standards and very specific metrics for measurement. Therefore, you know exactly where you fall in that values orientation, and you can measure performance and get that, your own performance, and of course, the performance of the people you lead. So when writing this book, I was like, wow, it's something really powerful, because orientation to your personal values plays a huge role in resilience, because people who either don't have clearly defined values, or they're inauthentic, or they have them and they stray from them every chance they get, tend to self-inflict more pain and suffering on themselves than they probably want to, are less successful. They tend to have poor relationships, or relationships that don't last, both professionally and personally. So I thought, well, maybe there's an adapted model here we can use for the book, which I thought was a really good way to further connect people to their own purpose. I don't want to overuse the talk about purpose and all those different things, because like I talk about in the book, like, don't just sit around wondering what your purpose is and, not, executing and working and finding a path towards what you really feel like you need to be doing with your life, but looking at your core values. And if you don't have them, sit down. And then the exercise takes you through the mechanism where you sit down and write a value on a Post-it note. If you want, you can do a list, whatever it is. But I like the whole the Crawford slip method, where you can take Post-it notes, put them on the mirror, put them on a whiteboard, and say, I believe in. Come up with 15 or 20 values you think you authentically believe in, and or, to be a little bit aspirational, should be more disciplined in, and then narrow it down to 4 or 5. You shouldn't have 10 core values. No person or organization should. There can be subsets of elements that combine together into different themes. You can take 20 values and associate them with certain themes and come up with what that value is. But then coming up, if you say, for example, integrity, that's something that I truly believe in. My grandfather instilled it in me, and integrity is one of my core values. Great. What does that specifically mean to you from a behavioral standpoint? How do you conduct yourself? How do you interact with others? So writing 2 or 3 behavioral standards down to help you better define what you mean by integrity. So, that could be associated with how you interact with others. Like I said, your definition of integrity, again, something you could look at, be like, I can measure that. And then even going a third layer below, saying, okay, how can I measure that on a regular basis? How can I look back at this, whether I'm celebrating a win, like I achieved that goal, how did my goal of integrity play a role? Well, let me look back at these definitions of behavioral standards, metrics or measurement. That's how I know integrity did actually play a role in winning in that regard. If I make some bad choices and I fall short in meeting this objective, or I'm struggling in my marriage, or I'm not being as good of a father as I really want to be, well, maybe I'm falling short, assuming integrity is an authentic value. Maybe that value or one of the other values that I've defined, maybe I'm falling short in one of those areas. So when you have those clearly defined, you have those behavioral standards and definitions and metrics and measurements, then you can go back and look very specifically at performance, either good or bad. A lot of organizations don't do that either. They have their nice core values. They were written in a vacuum by one founder years and years ago. And yeah, maybe they're on the website or they're on a wall in a conference room, but nobody knows them. Nobody knows what they really mean. Nobody certainly knows how to measure them from performance and behavioral standards. So bringing that into your personal journey as an individual, it's a great exercise too, just to go back and reflect on, what really drives you. And it's okay for your values to kind of evolve over time, especially your definition of what those values should be.
You're right. I love that model. And I love, 4 to 6 values. It all starts with your values. And I love how you add that there has to be some behavioral metrics, right? So when you're demonstrating that, yeah, I'm a person of integrity. Okay, so how are you showing that on a daily basis? And then not only that, but you add that additional level of accountability. Who's going to hold you accountable? Or are you holding yourself accountable? Because if you're not, it's going to be really hard to have that change be sustained over a long period of time.
Yeah. Yeah. You literally could give that values rubric to a coach, a mentor, an accountability partner, and be like, hold me to these. It's all written out right here. Hold me to that. And if I stray, let me know. Totally agree.
You got it. So the next topic I want to kind of touch upon is really temptation, because anyone that wants to be successful, make a difference in this world, have really their authentic voice shine, they're always going to be faced with temptation. And I know during SEALs training, especially during Hell Week, reading your books and others, there's a lot of people within that training, the instrucors just give up, just ring the bell. How do you stave off temptation, or what are some strategies that you found to be effective?
It always makes me laugh when thinking about that. Is yes, there is a certain role instructors play in those early days, or they're either tempting you with a warm blanket and hot chocolate or coffee, driving along in a truck next to you with the heat blasting and you're shivering, running down the beach, miserable. They're like, come on, Gleeson, hop on in here. And some guys fall for it. They're like, yep, I'm done. But 30 minutes later, when they're dry and warm, all they feel is regret, the sting of regret. But really, it comes down to these simple things. We talk about accountability and personal accountability. We talk about discipline, all these different things, but it comes down to following process. It comes down to having good mechanisms in place and good rituals that you try not to deviate from, that make battling temptation as easy as possible. That's really what I found to be the key. Like you said before, like, well, if you're an alcoholic, don't go to the bar, or make sure you don't keep booze in the house. If you're trying to lose weight, eat less junk food, don't buy junk food. Like those simple analogies, obviously, but put yourself in a position to win. don't put yourself in positions to be tempted more. Just what, like I said before, when I was pursuing this goal early on, I had to eliminate all temptation from my life, meaning I'm not going out to the bar for that one beer with the guys after work. Nope, I'm going for a long run and I'm going to bed early because I'm getting up early. I'm going to do it again. And so I had to, because I know my friends at the time, and it would have been one beer. It would have been 5 beers. And then I'd be like, ah, shit, why did I do that? Then my workout sucks the next day. And then you're, losing momentum. So that's what the taming temptation tiger was probably my favorite chapter to write in the book, because it allowed me to be a little bit creative with that, early narrative about the tiger and describing him and how he, lures people into his lair when they're actually on their way to Glory Town, but they get deviated and distracted and take detours to places that have nothing to do with achieving specific goals. So again, to simplify it, it goes back to removing things in our rituals in our lives, or creating new rituals that don't have anything to do with elements that will distract us from staying in the course, from being a healthier person, having better relationships, being more disciplined at home and at work or in our wellness practices, and really getting rid of everything else. If you try to muddle it all together, you're just putting more roadblocks or potential roadblocks in your way that you're going to have to eventually navigate. So why not remove as many of those roadblocks as possible, to just like a good strategic plan? One thing when we teach strategic planning, kind of follows a very simple mission planning model where, okay, we're clearly defining our objective. My objective is to lose 20 pounds, whatever it is. Clearly defined, commander's intent, clearly measurable mission statement, SMART goal, whatever you want to call it. All right, well, let's look at resources. What resources do I need to achieve that goal? Anything else? Move it out of the way. And the next step would be to look at threats and blockages, temptations, anything that could stand in your way of achieving that goal of losing 20 pounds in 6 months, whatever the time bound nature is. So that list, and that goes into any mission plan or any strategic plan in business, you need to look at those threats and blockages so you can navigate them accordingly and make the assumptions that those will pop up, or that they're already standing in your way. And so that's really what we're talking about. Then various things that will tempt you to deviate from that plan or that path will fall into that bucket of threats and blockages. But the more we proactively identify what those are, put a name to them, we're more likely to be able to eliminate them or have a little more foresight when see them coming a little faster to be able to course correct as needed. So
That's good, because that is the most effective strategy. I think a lot of leaders, a lot of people overall feel like they can resist it, and they really don't realize how tempting that's going to be, and in the state that they're in, that it's less likely that they're going to be able to resist that temptation. The better strategy is to eliminate it in the first place, or you're not even tempted to go down that path.
well, and reminding yourself or others, or if you're on a team, what are the negative consequences of deviating and being tempted by those things. I remember my previous company, we were going through a major transformation. A lot of operational things had to be tweaked so we could get over one of those inevitable growth plateaus, because we were growing quickly, which is great problem to have, but we hit some of those barriers and had to become mature and become a little more sophisticated, especially operationally. And one of the decisions that was made, even at the board level, reluctantly, very reluctantly, is that we're going to pause sales. We were a very sales driven organization, which was made. I was really more on the operations side, where I was CEO, but also, so therefore I'm in sales as well. But as my business partner, who was very sales, he was more of the sales solves everything kind of guy. So even to like give a nod to that in the boardroom was probably had internal bleeding just from even thinking about pausing sales. And lo and behold, we're a month into that, all these different things going on, a lot of change to manage, a lot of employee situations to manage with that change. And without mentioning to anybody, it goes out and announces at a company-wide meeting that we just landed our biggest client ever, because of the temptation to close that deal, and you want that revenue and all those great things. But telling a team of people who is already overstressed, they're burned out, dealing with a ton of constant change, everybody elated that we're going to pause pumping new clients and new programs on top of their plates, already full plates, and then telling them we just landed not just another client, but our biggest client ever. And you can imagine what giving into that temptation did to the morale of the team in the moment. We had a lot of backtracking to do after that unplanned announcement at the company-wide meeting. But those are real life examples of when whether we're talking about business and entrepreneurship or our personal lives, or we get distracted by things not with ill intent, but things that seem good. But sometimes the things we want the most in life are the worst things we could possibly have.
Very true. I also find that a lot of people like to focus and celebrate the world's most successful people and celebrate their success, right? And envy what they've accomplished. But there's not enough attention being paid to the road, the path that they had to go through to get there. So when I hear someone say he was an overnight success, in reality, that's a 20, 30-year process to get to that point. Now he's starting to be recognized, but not enough attention and lessons are gleaned from that journey because there's tons of obstacles, potholes, stuff that happens to them that they've had to overcome in order to get to that point. Like with the SEAL training, you're a SEAL, it's you're revered and honored, but it's not enough questions being asked on, so what was your journey to, give people inspiration, right? To say, I'm just not blessed. I mean, it just wasn't an easy path. It wasn't preordained in the stars. It took a lot, and there's a lot of difficulties that I had to endure and go through. That's like with your book, with David Goggins' book. It's nice to see that path, that journey, that it's not just everything worked out perfectly for you, but there's a lot you really had to overcome, which inspires people that maybe they could do the same.
Yeah, I've found, and I'm sure you found that quote unquote success or wisdom doesn't typically come from just a lot of good shit happening to you over and over again. Unfortunately, that's not where it comes from. It comes from getting punched in the face when you have a perfect plan. It comes to falling short. That, 2-year goal that you had ends up being a 5-year goal. You still don't quite achieve the objective the way you originally envisioned. But yeah, we see that all the time. We're like, oh, that, whether it's like a cool band that all of a sudden came out of nowhere and they're selling out stadiums. No, they've been working on that for 15 years. You just didn't know about it because they weren't famous, or like just the individuals. We tell these unicorn stories. Entrepreneurs love to focus on these unicorn stories, and you're fascinated by that journey. And it seemed like it was seemingly no adversity or a little bit of adversity, but you're also talking about the individual's journey. They're from their childhood up until the time they decided to be an entrepreneur or to pursue music or professional sports or whatever the avenue is. Typically, you're talking about almost a lifelong journey in some capacity. If you really looked back at what developed them into the person they are to be able to achieve the things they did, there were experiences, there were people, different influences that are part of that, the critical part of that path, both good and bad, that led them to be able to reach a certain level of success, however one should define that. And a lot of that is stories about adversity. You just don't hear those stories a lot because people don't want to talk about that stuff as much. Some do, and that's where you learn. I love the stories of adversity more than the big wins. So.
Oh, right. And you learn a lot more about it. I mean, in the book, you mentioned even after you got out of the Navy and you said, I was a Navy SEAL for crying out loud. Why wouldn't you want to throw money at me? Right. Because I'm going to take whatever I do and make it successful. And you had trouble raising money, getting those companies started. It wasn't just something that came easy and all the doors were open for you.
100%. And there were some things that came easier than I thought, but then that's when that's when I realized I had no idea what I was doing. And it really did very quickly go back to reminding myself on like how we build teams in naval special warfare, and how, when you're a new person on a team or going through training, you know nothing, and you're reminded that you know nothing. But being a lifelong learner, being humble, your humility is like one of the most powerful elements to good leadership. Knowing that you're not the smartest person in the room, you shouldn't be the smartest person in the room most of the time, and finding ways to just absorb every bit of knowledge about how to be successful, but also what are the potential pitfalls that will most certainly cross my path at some point, and there will be many. But yeah, it took some time to continue to instill that level of humility, because it was a whole different battlefield. It was yes, some of that SEAL resilience plays a role, and that creativity and adaptability. But when you're talking about something that's totally different, and you raise capital, so you're dealing with your money, other people's money. You're in a new space, new industry. You're doing something you've never done before. It is, talk about getting comfortable being uncomfortable, but it's a whole different playing field. Therefore, the discomfort is in some ways larger and more significant. So
I agree. And I love the story that you have as well, the Mark Owen story about rock climbing, and really speaking on that pillar of control, right? That a lot of people try to assume too much control, things that are outside of their control, they worry about, they have anxiety over. And one of the phrases that really kind of stood out to me is you need to stay in your 3-foot world right here and only focus on what's in your immediate control. Perhaps you can kind of give some backstory on that example as well, and just kind of unpack it a little bit more.
Yeah, so Mark Owen, like phenomenal friend of mine. Yeah, that's not his real name, obviously, but so he was in my first platoon at SEAL Team 5. We did our first combat deployment together. He was our point man, just phenomenal guy. Grew up in a small fishing village in Alaska, valedictorian of his high school class of 3 people, and then went to college in California, and then went to the team, similar to Pat. So he did college first and worked a little bit, and kind of became a friend and definitely a little bit of a mentor to me as a new person. He was on his second platoon cycle. And then I'd obviously learn a lot from each other going to war together, especially all of us going to war for the first time together. But he wrote, obviously, the book No Easy Day. And one of the things he talks about in that book, he also is the creator and executive producer of the show SEAL Team that's been phenomenally successful. So if you ever watch any of that show, you're going to hear the term 3-foot world. And it really goes back to the philosophy of staying focused on what's in your control. Again, situational awareness, but don't waste time, emotion, and energy on things you cannot impact or cannot control. In that moment, you'll have a greater likelihood of success if you just stay focused on things you can control. And so he tells this story about they're doing a lead climbing, rock climbing course outside of Las Vegas with his group he was with at the time. And he got up to a certain point and kind of got frozen in a specific spot. Lead climbing, for those who don't know, is you have a rope, but you're practicing to be the lead climber in a group of climbers. Therefore, you set protection in the rock face. You then climb up another 10 feet, 15 feet, depending upon your route. So you're 15 feet above your last piece of protection. So if you slip and fall, you're going to fall twice that amount, about 30 feet or more, until the rope catches you in a not so comfortable setting. And so, there's a little bit of a risk to it. Some people like heights, and some people don't, regardless if their job is SEALs. Anyways, he got into a position where he didn't have a good next move. And so he was kind of frozen, overanalyzing everything. And obviously the guys down below started making fun of him, and that wasn't helping. And the rock climber, or the coach, the course instructor, free climbed up to him, 100 feet off the ground, free climbed up to him and was like, "What's up, bro? What's the problem?" And he could see Matt, looking down at the guys, making fun of him. He could see Matt looking over at the skyline of Las Vegas and looking all around him, looking up, 20 feet above where he was. And he goes, "Stop, just stop, stay in your 3-foot world." And what he meant by 3-foot world really is like your arm span of what you can actually control between your arms, your legs, your footholds, your handholds. Stay in your 3-foot world. Focus working the problem right here. Don't worry about Las Vegas. Don't worry about the guys down there. They're not going to help you. That bomber hold 15 feet over to your right isn't going to help you, because you ain't going to get there until you focus on your 3-foot world. So it's a great philosophy, going back to what we talked about at the beginning of the challenge, commitment, and control pillars around resilience in the book. That really speaks to the control piece of focusing on what's in your control and not getting distracted by things you can't impact in the moment.
Some great insight and a great tool and a mindset to have. I used to believe this until I read your book, and I'm sure a lot of other people do, is that, SEALs are the best at what they do in their field. And they constantly are rehearsing, executing, debriefing over and over. But I assumed that the majority of their time was spent deployed. But I was completely wrong. That's only a fraction of the time. You had stated in the book that over 75% of your time is spent training, correct?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if nothing else, we are a learning organization. We're a training and development organization, which obviously is critically important for continuous improvement and high performance in naval special warfare or any elite, special operations unit. And therefore, from day one, you're constantly training. You spend a small fraction of your time deployed downrange. And even when you are deployed downrange, if you're not operating, eating, or sleeping, you're engaged typically in some form of training, whether that be, fitness training or in the gym or going on runs or swims, or on the shooting range, honing your skills, or building a kill house and running close quarters combat or in CQB drills, or using those tools for rehearsing that night's mission over and over and over again. And you're also debriefing every training scenario, and you're debriefing every single mission. And therefore, you're always extracting some type of lesson learned. Some are more actionable than others. You're documenting that information. You're sharing it with all the appropriate people across not just your group, but also across typically the whole team and intel reports and other types of centers of excellence where those types of lessons aren't to be available to others. But yeah, you spend all of your time training, and not just always training on the same things, but as you can imagine, with technological innovation, there's new tools, new weapon systems, new technology to learn, new things to test and evaluate to see if it would be good for the organization. So you're always in a state of professional development. It changes, but a traditional, so let's say a platoon cycle, if you will, a troop cycle, you might be spending 18 months training. And these are, combat experienced SEALs training over and over and over again. and then maybe about a 6-month deployment. And on that deployment, you're also training. And that's where a lot of organizations you see fall short is, most leaders, most organizations are just, well, they know like, yeah, we got to invest in talent development and it's a great employee engagement initiative and we got to train our people. Yeah. But, what's the first thing to get cut? When people want to cut budget or think there might be a recession looming, typically marketing, talent development, and a small subset of other expenses they deem to be not essential to the success of the organization. I learned this, the hard way in my first two companies where, we're focused on sales, we're focused on growth, focused on EBITDA, profitability, and the things that we would be talking about in our board meetings. But realizing, going back to it, finally, where I really, during that transformation, I shifted a lot of my energy to talent development and culture initiatives and employee engagement strategies, because that's your biggest asset in most organizations. You're not training your people, you're not getting the utmost of their talent and energy into driving the mission of the organization. You're missing a huge opportunity to not just build a sustainable company, but that's where your profit typically lies, because it's your people creating a great customer experience, a great client experience, a high quality product or service, and only highly engaged, well-trained people do that. Otherwise, everybody else falls into kind of that disengaged, kind of doing things a little bit half-assed or bare minimum type of productivity, in the workplace. But as we all know, we just don't always do it. When you invest in developing your people, you have a higher likelihood of retaining them, first of all, especially your top talent, but also you're going to get a lot more out of them and they're going to be happier, more engaged. They're more likely to mentor and coach others as well and really evangelize the culture and values of the organization and do the same with the customers and clients. And that builds a great, very sustainable, sometimes high growth and profitable team, if you will. And the same applies in naval special warfare.
Well, that was great to hear, because I think a lot of organizations could use that as a model, right? I mean, the amount of time you're in a continuous state of improvement. You mentioned the book Kaizen, which is a Japanese term for just a state of continuous improvement, development. It never, regardless of how good you are, the expert that you might be, the elite level special ops soldier is still constantly training, refining their craft, as should organizations that want to be on top. And you're right, people are your most important asset. And I couldn't agree with you more regarding the fact that in times of recessions, the first thing to cut is development training, right? Which it's at those times that you really should up your investment in your people.
100%. And that's not just my opinion. It shows like the companies that come out of, I'm not saying we're in a recession, but I'm saying, we saw this in COVID or other types of things, or back in 2008, 2009, companies, they chop heads, they chop marketing, they chop talent development. They come out weaker every single time on the other side of whatever that obstacle is. Whereas the other organizations that find ways and find budget or some type of internal resource to stay the course and really invest in their people, they will retain the best talent. And they typically find ways to grow during those down cycles and gain some subset of market share, or have the stronger ability to do so on the other side of that obstacle. Whereas the other organizations that don't almost always are in a much worse position than they were previous to whatever that obstacle was.
You're right. And I've read tons of self-help books, and the majority of them really kind of push more of the framework of how to be happy, empowered, engage in positive self-talk, how to be in a fabulous relationship, build wealth, you name it, how to be anything other than really, the suffering that's going to be inevitable for most of us in parts of our lives. And like you said, there's purposeful suffering, there's suffering that you really don't want to have anyone go through. But that's what I loved about your book and your mindset and your philosophy, that we all experience suffering. So why fight it? Better to embrace it, to understand it, and to learn to walk with it in some form of harmony.
Absolutely. And I think the more that you can do that in a very productive and healthy manner, you build kind of like, my buddy David Goggins would say, you build these mental calluses. I love that philosophy of the mental callus, where you become, you're not more immune, but you're just more accepting of these inevitable adversities and emotional, physical, what have you, where you almost expect them to come at some point. And, you have a greater capacity to move more quickly out of that, bunker of normal human emotion and grief processing. And you move more quickly into action-oriented thinking of saying, all right, yep, this fucking sucks. Great. It is what it is. It's happening right now. Let's find a way. Let's do an analysis. Why did this happen? How did I contribute to this issue? Maybe I did, maybe I didn't. Whatever that ends up being, whatever data you can extract, then applying that to whatever your strategic plan and actions are going to be to achieve some type of result coming out of that. And the more you can do that, you kind of take the emotion out of it a little bit by just making it a little bit more of an analytical approach to saying, yes, this thing is happening or these things are happening. So they're not going away anytime soon. And, people always that joke like, well, the thing about problems is they're going to be there tomorrow. So you might as well address them today. That was something I actually struggled with, especially I think just as a human, but that was feedback I got too from 360s and coaching, as an earlier entrepreneur, and I'm always working on it now, was that I'm a bit of a conflict avoider, interestingly enough, which is why I actually really enjoyed writing this book and doing the research. That's something I've struggled with, especially as a leader. But my wife would tell you, she gives me great radical candor on a daily basis. She's like, you're sticking your head in the sand again. You're not addressing it, right between the eyes. And so it's something that I'm always trying to work on and get feedback about. But what I've found, like a lot of people do, is the more you get into a regular rhythm of addressing challenges, addressing adversity, obstacles, whatever they might be, big or small, head on with a more analytical approach, trying to take emotion out of it, you do build those mental calluses, and you will move more quickly beyond all those obstacles that we'll face from now till the day we die in a more resilient fashion. You're more likely to learn something more quickly from them and to be able to apply that to whatever the next thing is. It will come. And so you kind of create more of a process for learning and application than when we're all just sitting around like, bleeding out on the battlefield, wondering why me. So there's nothing helpful for doing that.
That's great. I love that advice. And that's a great way to end this episode. Some practical tips that they can use to really embrace the suck that happens every day with every one of us and just to live a more meaningful, purposeful life. Thank you so much, Brent, for joining me today on the podcast. Remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you.
Sure. And first of all, thank you so much. Really enjoyed our conversation. Looking forward to doing it again sometime. I'm on LinkedIn, so anybody can look me up. My last name is spelled Gleeson, so Brent Gleeson. Also on Instagram. Our company website is takingpointleadership.com. We also have a new flagship e-learning platform that's under the URL of takingpointacademy.com. Also have a Forbes leadership column I've written on for over 10 years. So a lot of the topics we talked about are leadership, resilience, adaptability, mental fortitude. So just doing a simple Google search for Forbes, Brent Gleeson, but also all those resources and links are on the takingpointleadership.com website. So thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to share with others and post about it on social media. You can also go to our YouTube channel, which has video recordings of all the episodes of this podcast, along with bite-sized segments called single servings that are designed to answer your most pressing leadership and management questions. Remember, until next time, it's not what you know that counts, but what you do consistently that makes a difference.